Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here, joined by a very special guest. We have Michael Horn on the show. Michael, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Michael's got quite an extensive pedigree here. So he's an author and co-author of multiple books, white papers, and articles in education, including Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the way the world learns. An Amazon bestseller, Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools. You're an expert on disruptive innovation, a la Clayton Christensen, who I think really popularized the way we think of disruption these days. Host of the Future You podcast. The list literally goes on and on, but I will forego the rest of the list, and we can maybe dig in a little bit to the conversation. Most recently, or actually like really within the next week or so, the book Choosing College is about to hit the presses right in time for back to school. So wanted to spend some time with you, Michael, talking about that book, which as I mentioned when we were getting started, I did power through over the weekend and got quite a bit out of it. It's an interesting blend of some frameworks that are typically used in maybe business books around jobs to be done. Your partner, Bob Moesta?
Yep.
Okay.
That's
yeah,
right.
Bob,
yep, you got it. Yep.
Who came up with the whole idea of jobs to be done. You and he partnered to really adopt the jobs to be done framework, to apply it to the really complex and challenging learning decisions that people have to make around choosing a college and getting the right value out of that exchange. Can you give us a little bit of context around what drove you and Bob partnering to write Choosing College?
Yeah, so at the Clayton Christensen Institute, where I'm a distinguished fellow and founded it with Clay Christensen, we basically for several years have been wondering, why do students go to school? And we had sort of this nagging hypothesis that schools were actually serving students that were coming to them for many different reasons. And therefore it was causing schools to try to be one-size-fits-all operations, which was driving up administrative overhead, creating services that were relevant to one group but not another, and just were confusing and conflicting, and really causing a lot of the poor success rates that we often see in college. And so we were just frankly curious to get under the hood and learn more. And so we started doing this research. And indeed, it proved that, but I would say it also proved a few other things, which was Clay and I for years have written articles where we would speculate about what jobs people hire college to do for them. And we were totally wrong. All of our instincts were just not at all in the ballpark. And it just goes to show you actually got to talk to the people themselves to figure out their own stories. And I'd say the stories that came out of it were so fascinating that Bob and I, as we were doing the research, were like, there's a book here to help people make better choices, to help schools design better experiences, and to really illuminate the stories themselves and let them sort of speak for themselves.
Yeah. And I did enjoy the methodology that you used as well, where, it was research-based, but it was also very personal, like human narratives. So like each of the jobs to be done that you outlined, there are 5 that we'll talk through. But for each of those 5 jobs to be done where people hire college to do this job for them, you provide a handful of narrative examples, some of which actually interweave really throughout the book. Can you talk a little bit about that methodology? And what I really liked about it was the fact that you were both research-based, but also true to these individuals' stories. And the importance of storytelling and narrative, I think, is something we talk a lot about on the show. Can you explain your methodology a little bit?
Totally, and you're exactly right. So the jobs to be done methodology itself, frankly, came out of this observation that most people, when they design services or experiences or products for people, that they're doing it from the perspective of the company and what they think someone ought to want in their lives. But the only way to really figure out what people want is to observe what they actually do in their day-to-day lives. What do they prioritize? What do they ignore? And it turns out you actually can't just ask customers what they want because they lie to you, not
Right.
because they're not because they're trying to, but because, you know, they don't always know. And if the world was a blank slate, sure, they'd want everything in the world, but they actually have to make priorities and trade-offs as they live life. And so what we do in the research methodology is just, we created over 200 stories of students making the decision to go to college. So they're literally mini documentaries. And that's how we came up with both the jobs that we found, but then also the advice for the students. But then those stories, to your point, just live as really interesting stories about how students made these really tough choices in some points in time, really emotional, social factors that weighed on them. And we said, gosh, let's just let it speak for itself because they're so compelling and they tell the jobs way better than, you know, academic language would, if you will, around these things. And just getting to see them or feel them, I think, is much more impactful and powerful. And the last thing I would say is, by telling the stories, what we really want is for a reader of the book to say, oh, I identify with that, right? That's where I am, not maybe in general, but right now in my life. And therefore, what does that mean for what I should or shouldn't do?
Yeah, no, and it's you know, it was interesting to me, and I think Bob in particular at one point talks about how, you know, in many ways he had gone through all 5 of these types of jobs throughout his life. That was very much that part spoke to me too. As you're approaching your middle years, you can really begin to identify with stories really across the full gamut here. And I also really liked, just, you know, coincidentally, I did recently read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, and the idea that his story in some ways mapped directly to the types of stories that you were sort of capturing in your research. To me, like, we like to talk, there's a joke on the show that I try to say zeitgeist or zeitgeisty just about every show, but this is one of those examples where, like, it felt that, you know, first off, you know, something that's very much top of mind is the importance of empathy and storytelling, and also diversity and inclusion. And, like, it did seem like you cast very thoughtfully, and, you know, there is a section where you outline your methodology, but you very intentionally wanted to get a nice you know, cross section of all the types of people, including lifelong learners, you know, including people early or mid-career were trying to upskill. Can you talk about that aspect of the methodology too, where, like, it did seem like you were very intentional, and that was another word that I wrote down in terms of my prep, like the idea of intentionality. You know, you guys definitely represented it in how the book came together, but it also seemed as though one of the ideas was be intentional about your own engagement here. But can you talk a little bit about how you really created the cross section that you interviewed?
So you're spot on, and I will say up front, a sneaking hope of ours is that people will buy it for their kids and then realize that it applies to them right now in their lives today, actually, because we're all lifelong learners. We're all constantly learning, whether that's through podcasts like this one, online courses that we might stumble upon, little videos on YouTube, or frankly, bigger experiences that we might delve into. And so what we really wanted to do is exactly that. We wanted to work with a range of institutions. So we partnered with 8 different universities and 1 company that serves students in all sorts of different institutions, and say, how do we reach students that are at all stages of life with the process of choosing everything from college to coding boot camps to online universities. And by doing so, the hope was that we would get a pretty wide range of stories that would represent what America looks like in terms of these decisions around ongoing education after high school. I don't know that we got it exactly right in terms of representation, so we're cautious about making any, statements around, well, this job is X% of the American population, but that's not really the point. The point was to get a pretty broad section so that any person that picks this book up can find themselves in it and see themselves in a clear way. And, it's interesting, things like race or income level, those don't cause you to be in a particular job to be done, but by using those demographics, you use them to your advantage to make sure you capture every single use case that might be out there, so that you capture all the circumstances a student might be in, to understand why they're going and what are they facing and what are they trying to solve in their lives and what's the progress that they're really trying to make.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, and it really jumped out at me while I was reading the book, is that you're not overly cognitive in your approach, which I really liked. The fact that you're trying to understand the emotional needs and the social contexts in which people are making these decisions. We also talk a lot about behavioral economics and decision science, decision education. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it does, and maybe as you do that, we could get into the 5 examples a bit. But what I was struck by was that it wasn't purely cognitive and sort of coldly calculating.
Yep.
It did seem very much as why would someone make a decision like this, and what would be the emotional drivers and the social drivers as much as the cognitive ones?
Yeah, you're spot on. So, what we realize when people have a job to be done, and what we define that is the progress that you're trying to make in a particular circumstance in your life. It's that simple. A lot of people will tend to focus on the functional aspects of it. So they'll be curious, will you get more money for having this degree? Or, if you get this degree, you'll earn X, and therefore that'll allow you to get this entry point into this career. And frankly, that's how Clay and I tended to write about it before we did the research. We would say, people hire college to launch a career, switch jobs, things like that. Very functional reasons. But when you actually do jobs to be done research, and this isn't just in education, it's in all spheres, you realize that the social and emotional reasons we do things are way more powerful often than the functional or cognitive ones, as you put it. And I think that's exactly right. We often call that, quote, the irrational thinking or something like that, but it's not irrational, because it's understanding the emotional and social context you're in, and what is pushing and pulling you to make a change in your life. And that's really what it's about. And if you ignore that social and emotional aspect, you're sort of cutting off half the person, at least,
right,
who is making that decision. And so it's really important to understand what's the family pressures, what's the societal pressures, what is your guidance counselor and your teacher telling you to do, right? That's weighing on the social pieces. On the emotional side, what are your worries? What are your hopes, right? What's keeping you up at night? What if, it's things like nagging you. What if I don't do this and show my kid that I can do X, right? All these little things that you wouldn't necessarily process if you were sitting in a closed room with a whiteboard of how to design college, but are actually very real in the lives of people who are making this choice.
Yeah. And a related point, I think, is the sort of the notion of decision inertia. It just seemed as though, in some of the jobs in particular, I want to do what's expected of me, or, I need to help get away from a situation, or even just getting into the best school. A lot of that is I don't really have an end game in mind. I am sort of going with the flow, just like I went with the flow right through high school to get my high school degree.
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep on rolling that way right on through higher ed. And in some ways I viewed the book as somewhat cautionary about that mode, where it gets back to that idea of intentionality I was talking about, where college is frequently very expensive, financially expensive, but also just psychologically taxing. It's a big investment of your time. And, there is almost a default way of thinking about, well, I got to go to college, or I got to get into the best college. In some ways, that's driving a lot of the problems that are out in the world today. So I do want to get your take on those things a bit. But what do you think about that? And how does that relate to what how you're trying to reach people to maybe change the way they might think about some of these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is unconscious that exists in us. And in many ways, I hope the book serves to make that unconscious part of our decision-making conscious, so that you can recognize it in yourself and then make a more appropriate decision. Because so much of us, to your point, we have uncertainty about what we want out of the experience at the end of it. And that's just real. I mean, you look at all the surveys now and people say, well, everyone's going to college to get a job. yeah, maybe, but they don't really understand what field they want to work in. They don't really know what a job is. You
Right,
know,
right.
the teen participation rate right now in the workforce is the lowest it's ever been, I think, in our nation's history.
Yep.
And so, you know, these things that seem tangible are not in fact so, and that actually feels real when you step back into your own decision-making process of the uncertainty, the anxiety that you felt.
Hmm.
And really what we notice in this process, but in every process, is that for you to make a change, for you to do something, the pushes in your lives and the pulls, what you want to get out of it, they have to overcome these anxieties and habits that you currently have.
Hmm.
And the push of, well, the next logical step is college, and that's just what you're going to do because you're going to do it.
Yeah.
It's super strong in our society.
Yep.
It's just an embedded expectation, and it drives so much behavior. And our big step back, to your point, and maybe I'll just lay these out right now, the 5 jobs that we found. The first one was help me get into my best school. Really strange job, because the outcome that people are seeking is the result itself of
Yeah.
getting in.
Yeah. You're
It's
done.
all about getting in. I've done it. Now what? The second one is help me do what's expected of me. So these are students who are going because someone else demanded, in effect, that they do so. Their parents,
Hmm.
society, their guidance counselor, whatever. The third one is help me get away. So I'm running from something, not necessarily to something.
Hmm.
We'll come back to that in a moment. The fourth one was help me step it up. So these are students who are looking around at their lives and they're like, just isn't me. This isn't who I am. I'm sick of living, you know, paycheck to paycheck, whatever it might be. I'm scared of where things are headed, and I got to step it up. I got to do something about this. And then the last one is what we call help me extend myself, which is, you know, things are actually pretty good, but I've always wanted to learn X, and now I have the time and budget to do
Hmm.
so. And so I'm going to go pursue that.
Yeah.
Uh, What's interesting, say, take the help me get away job. If you're running from something, say an abusive stepfather is one of the stories we tell in the
Yep.
book, of Naomi in the book. Um, you know, getting away is the most important thing. But very little of your decision is about what's on the other side of college, or what you'll get out of it,
Hmm.
or even thinking about the 4 years and the debt you're about to go into to
Yep.
afford that experience. Maybe you want to step back and say, gee, is there a shorter, less costly experience I can do to
Hmm.
learn a lot about myself, and then make a more informed decision that's more likely to result in success?
Hmm. Yeah. And that's where, like, interestingly, like, we've been focusing a lot on decision education on the show recently. And in many ways, this book is a very practical guide to making smart decisions around how college and education should factor into your life. What I liked about it in particular was that um, pulling back, and like, I'd love to get a little more perspective from you on the gap year,
Hmm.
because like, I think obviously these things are they're challenging decisions to make one way or another, but the idea of being somewhat bold and courageous about your own path, realizing that we're going to live 70, 80, 100 years, and there's plenty of time within that full arc to understand how to get the best educational outcomes for yourself. Can you talk a little bit about ways in which you're perhaps more open to surprising decisions, and honest, even in the case of the gap year, you know, there's some pretty strong recommendations about not being, too casual about making that kind of choice. Can you talk a
Totally.
little bit about that?
Totally. So, and I'll just say up front, my wife was joking with me. She said, "I can't believe it took you an entire book that you had to research and write to figure out that a gap year might be a good idea for students." uh, she said, "I would have just told you that, if you'd asked." But the point is just that, which is that because we have this uncertainty in our lives, high school for many students is not a place where we really build passion and purpose and an understanding of what we want next in any defined way outside of, well, we think the next logical step is college, so I guess I might as well go, or it's socially acceptable to go. Why not take a structured gap year, not where you just sort of gallivant around Europe, but you use that year to learn more about yourself, invest in yourself, try on or prototype a variety of different career pathways, learning experiences, apprenticeships, community experiences, and the like, to figure out, I want more of this, less of that. These are the sorts of things I'm attracted to help you make a better choice about what might maybe be a full 4-year college experience in the next step.
Hmm.
And so we make a lot of recommendations that the gap year can be an enormously helpful year in teaching you about you and where you are right now, to really make a more informed choice. And you don't have to rush in college, to your point. Like, you know, whether I went to college right after I graduated high school or waited a year or two, in the grand scheme of life, you know, when you discount for present value, I suppose that's probably part of, you know, these decision equations. It's going to net out. And what's more important is to make the right decision than the fast decision.
Yeah.
And so the gap year is a really neat way to do that. And one of the things that, you know, the research says is, well, that works really well for people like, President Obama's daughter, Malia Obama, who took a gap year when they have the privilege and money to be able to do so.
Right.
But what about a low income student? You know, if they take a year off, their likelihood of going back to college is significantly lower. Research is pretty clear on that. And our takeaway was, okay, that's true, but if you take a gap year and you put structure around it, you say, I'm going to do it for exactly a year and then make this decision, or you know, some sort of time-bound nature around it. And secondly, you use the year to actually earn money. So it's actually value creating in a way that college is not.
Right.
And you learn a lot more about yourself, and then you commit to invest in yourself in the next phase when you have learned more and you've answered some open-ended questions about yourself. Then you can make a really rewarding decision around college, because what we know about the stats in college is that the success rates are actually not very high. And so why not do something that actually improves your success rates of completion? And the last thing we know about the gap year from research is that when you control for all factors, academic, socioeconomic, et cetera, any given student who takes a gap year and comes into college versus any student who does not take a gap year and just goes direct, the student who takes the gap year almost always does better, because they're hungrier, they have a clearer sense of why they're in college, and they're just ready to go attack it in a way that the student who's just gone straight just isn't. So gap years can be enormously valuable.
Yeah, and interestingly, the book's relevant to students who are making these choices, obviously relevant to parents, but also I liked that you got into sort of the venture space. Like, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're trying to figure out where the biggest opportunities are, and then even some examples of more innovative attempts, at least, at modernizing and sort of transforming what college is. One of the examples that I thought was really interesting was the Wayfinding Academy. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I also thought that, and maybe related to that, is the potential value of an associate's degree or other smaller interim steps, rather than diving in whole hog into an expensive 4-year program.
Yeah, Wayfinding Academy is a fascinating program out of Portland, Oregon. It's a new university, 2-year program where the curriculum is essentially learning about yourself and figuring out what your purpose is in life, so that you can then go on into a chosen field or more education. And it's all about getting you an associate's degree, essentially, and understanding yourself. And so they've done a huge course sequence all around self-discovery and things of that nature, and plenty of community or experiential learning opportunities to be out in the community to build knowledge and skills, for sure, but in the service of understanding yourself better. Super interesting experience. The woman who created it has this great quote in a talk that she's giving about it, where she says, you know, right now we basically have you apply to college, where you choose your major, and then you go through, and then you go out into the other world and realize that's not at all what I wanted. And we think we have this totally backwards. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, the quote, and probably slightly screwing it up, but you know, we ought to do this backwards. We ought to figure out, how do you get experience in the real world to learn what you actually want to do, and then get you the education in service of that. And so that's how we've structured our curriculum. We obviously raise a number of questions in the book, if they've done it the right way, if it'll succeed, if understanding what we've understood about the jobs, if they've set it up exactly correct. But I think the thrust of it is right, which is that this understanding what you actually like and what you want to do and you're passionate about is actually a pretty fundamental prerequisite for a lot of the college pathways you might choose, and something that, if you don't invest in yourself ahead of time, you could end up in a place where you're saying, gosh, I just got through the accounting degree. I hate accounting. I don't want to be an accountant. No one told me that this was what was involved. I don't want a desk job. And there's little tricks that you can just do to learn a lot about yourself to avoid that.
Yeah. And I liked where you and first off, we talk about learning transfer a lot on the show too. The idea of taking ideas from one space and applying it to an adjacent one. I liked the sort of infusion of sort of lean product thinking, agile design, but like, why make that, 4-year, 6-figure plus investment when you could, let's say you're in the, help me get away job. Like, why think that long? Like, if you want to get away from maybe a home situation that isn't great for you, you can do that in a way that doesn't commit you to a 4-year program that will be expensive. You'll be taking on that debt, so it did seem to sort of put those decisions in context and borrow ideas from software development and business. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like almost the decision calculus and how like at times it'll be fine to sort of pursue, like make those big decisions, jump into that 4-year degree, but there are times when it actually makes more sense to be more agile and responsive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the big, a big takeaway is that every job to be done that you're in has a certain time horizon associated with it. And I've been told that's actually one of the most useful parts of the book, is sort of thinking about the time horizon. So like you said, if you're trying to get away from something, the time horizon is however long it takes you to get away. And then you're shifting jobs. You're in a new circumstance with a new motivation to make progress in your life. And so you ought to think about a decision that doesn't overcommit you past that time horizon, in effect. If you're trying to step it up and you know the career that you want to go into, that's a different calculus, right? You want to go be a nurse, say, and you know that the program takes you 2 years, say, to become a registered nurse. Well, then that's your pathway. And then your time horizon as governed by what you're going to step up into in your life, right? And so, help me do what's expected of me. Same thing. We basically say, hey, once you've fulfilled someone's expectations of you, then what, right? So how do you narrow, and this one actually is really hard because those expectations can stay on you. And there we sort of say, you got to fight against those expectations and figure out how to bring it back into a shorter time horizon so that you can do exactly what you're saying, this lean startup sort of approach, where you're going to quickly say, okay, we're going to prototype a potential pathway for me, learn about what I like and don't like, reflect on that, and then make a different decision. It's basically the test and learn mindset that entrepreneurs bring, I think, to their problems all the time. We really want to port that into your educational decision making as well. And I'll tell you, a book that was super influential in my thinking on this was Design Your Life by the two professors at Stanford who are beacons of design thinking. And what's really interesting is, and Bob talks about this all the time, jobs to be done is just a way of unearthing the progress that you're trying to make in your life. But then to actually do something about it, you need to enter a design thinking process where you start iterating on possible solutions. Because, look, in the book, we throw out some potential ways entrepreneurs and colleges could better innovate to serve these jobs. But at the end of the day, people are going to actually just have to try some things that they hypothesize will match those jobs, test them, learn from them, and then iterate again and build something different and prototype something different. And learners ought to be doing the same thing to get to a more demand-driven view of education.
Yeah. So along those lines, or maybe sort of a related idea, is just the whole concept of lifelong learning and the distinction that sort of is woven throughout the book of intrinsic versus extrinsic value of education. And, in essence, we're always lifelong learners our whole life. And then frequently college is more an extrinsic decision that people make, where they're saying, I need to go to college so I can make more money downstream, or I need to go to college so that I can please my parents, or I need to go to college so that I can get out of this town. All those things are a little more, transactional. And then the contrasting that is this idea of education is part of why I'm here, and it's part of what really drives me. As like the lifelong learning part is something that resonated the most to me. But it is interesting where, like, I think some of the ways in which I became a lifelong learner started right around when I was entering college. So can you talk a little bit about extrinsic versus intrinsic, and then also perhaps how we all wear different hats or hire different
Yeah.
jobs throughout our lives?
Totally. So, and you can cut it a couple different ways, but if you're doing if you're going to school to do, fulfill what someone else expects of you, that is fundamentally an extrinsic pressure on you. It's not intrinsically, it doesn't come from within you. It's not an internal motivation that I want to do this for myself.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about the Help Me Get Away is that might be intrinsically motivated, but it's not intrinsically motivated about the college experience itself. It's, I need to get away from some circumstances that are extrinsic for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not intrinsically motivated by the college experience itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as you progress in your life and as you enter different phases, what I think a lot of people realize is you start to get into the help me extend myself,
Mm-hmm.
which is a deeply intrinsic reason for wanting to learn it for learning's sake itself, right? And it's sort of this, I've always wanted to know X. I've always wanted to challenge myself with Y. I've always wanted to learn more about this, or I've always wanted to be something else,
Mm-hmm.
not because my life is in a bad state. Like things are good, actually, relatively speaking,
Mm-hmm.
but this is something that I now have the time and I really want to invest in myself around. And that's a very cool reason to be learning. I joked to Bob when we unearthed this one that I had never experienced this job in my life with a mortgage and 2 kids under 5 and so forth. And he said, well, sure you have, but your version of it is hiring this podcast here, or,
Yes. Yeah.
or checking out a video on YouTube or reading a book or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're not, Michael, going to, bet the bank and go into a 4-year PhD program or something like that, or an 8-year PhD program or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And not earn for many years and so forth. And so it's really risk adjusted for where you are, but it is investing in you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important concept. And I kind of wish we had gone deeper in this in the book, but the Help Me Get Into My Best School Job, a lot of admissions officers, when they read that one, they were like, I hate that one. That's why my students come here and it's empty, it's vacuous. And I was saying, like, I agree with you on the one hand, but I also know that that was me
Sure.
as a student. Clearly when I went to college, it was to get into the best school for me, right? And as I thought about it, there's probably 2 different variations of that job. If we had dug deeper, there's probably an extrinsically motivated version of that, where it's, I want to get into my best school so I can show others around me, socially motivated. I can show them, right? And this is what leads to the varsity blues scandal and things of that nature.
Yes.
And then there's probably an intrinsically motivated one, which is I want to get into the best school for me because I'm genuinely interested about stretching myself. I'm interested in being around people that will challenge me, that will teach me new things,
Mm-hmm.
that'll expose me to new stratas of society. And I think when I think about why I went to school, I think it was more that. It wasn't that I needed to have a ranking on my list. I'm sure that was part of it,
Sure.
but it was more like I was genuinely excited. And I think, like you, when I went to college, I remember thinking to myself, finally, the rat race is over. I don't have to worry about grades. I'm get to learn for its own sake.
Right.
No one told me that grad schools would actually care about grades, and that it turns out that it still does matter. But the point is, I was so relieved and just excited to learn for its own sake, which I think is something that has increased in me over time,
Mm-hmm.
and built a reservoir of intrinsic motivation for it. And it sort of echoes a quote that you often hear about higher ed, which is that it's wasted on the young.
Yes.
And I think there's something to that when you sort of think about these phases of life that you will pass through as you learn in different contexts.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting when you were talking about the opportunities, the potential venture opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities around, the aging generations, but really even the younger generations are still going to, they're on YouTube constantly. I like to say we're in a golden age of informal learning.
Totally.
And, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that when you're engaging in what feels like an entertainment activity, it's also a learning activity. And, a lot of it is really like a mindset component.
If you're engaged, you're learning, right? And that can be from, reading the newspaper in the morning to watching a YouTube video to frankly, just the conversations that you have during the day. If you're engaged and you're processing and you're thinking about what something means, that is the act of learning.
Yeah.
And we don't count it as learning too often in the education system, which I think is a huge mistake. And it's something that in the conclusion we sort of attack, which is that that institutions ought to think more deliberately about how do we understand the mastery of all learning that occurs in someone's life and be able to give credit effectively for it and think about gauging the mastery of learning as opposed to the time I spend in a formal institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're coming up on time. one of my favorite quotes is William Gibson's quote, "The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed."
Yes.
As somebody who's well versed, the book was wonderful in terms of examples of emerging models, disruptive models. I know that's very much the innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen.
Yeah.
Where do you think we're furthest ahead right now? Are there trends that you think are just emerging now that are going to take a few years, but if folks want to understand, a few examples or a few types of programs that you think are really potentially transformative, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll give a couple examples. So one, I think on the gap year front, we're going to see a lot more curated programs that allow students to step through an experience and have financial aid dollars and things of that nature that allow many more students to embrace those experiences. So like Global Citizen Years is something that we talk about in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're doing fascinating things around this self-discovery job for students that in a very cool curated experience that I think will build a lot of understanding of self for folks.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about Wayfinding Academy. I think another one is Project Wayfinder, which works with high schools and colleges around the act of helping students discover their purpose in life. And I think little projects like that will be really important as well on this road. It's not something we wrote about. It's something I learned about after we put the book to bed, but I wish I had written about. And then I guess on the flip side of it, I think you're right, the informal learning opportunities. So everything from the coding boot camps of the world to online courses to connecting with tutors worldwide and so forth. In terms of the help me step it up and help me extend myself jobs, I just think there's so much innovation going on in those two fronts. And for all the higher ed institutions right now bemoaning the fact that there's fewer traditional college age students coming into their world, I think they're missing the forest from the trees, which is to say there's never been a better time to be in the business of education because so many people want to and need to learn throughout their lives. And that's a great thing, I think, right now.
Yeah, and we've been talking about it too from the perspective of public-private partnerships too. Like recently we were covering Starbucks graduating, the first 3,000 of its college achievement program partnering with ASU Online. So like that's another way to understand the lifelong learning aspect of higher ed, and those types of partnerships are something we're really curious about because the Step It Up job to be done is a really interesting one too. So we haven't, I know we're close to time, but can you just touch on that one real quick? Cause I think that's, that one is also enormously relevant. It's a little more maybe extrinsic in a way where you're thinking about the return on it in your sort of career growth. But I thought that was another one that maybe we'll round out our coverage of all the jobs.
Step It Up selfishly may be our favorite of the jobs because I think it's the most primal energy around it, right? It's students who really are going back because they're clear about what they want next in their lives. They need to do something different, and so they're making a change. In effect, and education is the gateway to that change.
Yeah,
I will say you don't only have to hire education. I would argue that in one of my career switches that I had I looked around me and I said, I need to step it up. And I switched to another job that allowed me to grow myself. And so it's not just that you have to hire education, but I think the demand for the Step It Up job is going to be constant throughout life, given the given the pace at which skills are constantly changing right now in our society. And so I think for students, they're going to be constantly in this mode of, this is no longer who I am. I need to step it up. I need more education to get me to the point where I want to go. And it's an enormous value creating job. And I think institutions that figure out ways to do this in the most direct path, they understand why students are coming to them. They're good at vetting to make sure that students understand why they're coming to them, and then can launch them on those paths in the most direct, efficient way to get them from point A to point B, will be tremendously successful because there is so much need and energy around this job. Yeah,
absolutely. And any parting thoughts? This is a wonderful conversation. I got to say, I did get a lot out of the book. And as a lifelong learner, my son is 8 months old, so he's got a little time, I hope, between now and when we have to choose college. But I did find it relevant to me as a lifelong learner and also as someone just fascinated by learning and education. So I really think you and Bob did wonderful work here. But any parting thoughts as we wrap up here?
Well, I'm super appreciative that you found the book helpful. And I think that's exactly what we want to do, which is to help learners at any stage of our lives. And we are all learners, especially today, but probably always throughout our lives. And we wanted to help people make better decisions and sort of make the circumstances that they're confronting these decisions in more transparent. I am sure we don't have all the answers, and I hope that humility comes across in the book. And I just hope as people engage with it and they see new things, or they see things that entrepreneurs could do or that learners could do to unlock different pathways, that they reach out to us and say, hey, this is another pathway you ought to share with folks, another technique, a tactic, or whatever it is. And we'll keep writing about it and learning from it, because I think that's what we're all doing, is using this framework, hopefully, to drive more decisions. And the last thing I guess I'd say is, as this becomes more known and entrepreneurs and schools start to innovate against these jobs, the jobs themselves will probably change over time. And that's a great thing, because it's a dynamic world, and hopefully it can allow us all to make more progress.
Awesome. I have a feeling this may not be the last we're hearing from Michael and team on this particular topic. This was Michael Horn. Thanks again for being a guest on our show. And the book is Choosing College. It's hitting the bookshelves and Amazon and anywhere you can buy a book. It's really a wonderful read. I'd recommend it to our listeners. I'd also recommend tracking Michael on, he's one of the LinkedIn influencers. He's got a podcast. Do a little research. He's really a fascinating thinker. He's got a lot of really great ideas. Same thing if you're not familiar with Clayton Christensen and what's happening up there. Michael and Clayton are close, and the whole notion of disruption really came from there. So thanks again for being on the show. Thanks to our listeners for listening in, and we'll see you next time on Trending in Education.